Chinese medicine education varies from school to school, but what a lot of people don't realize is that this is actually fairly modern from like the 1960s and 70s. Chairman Mao kind of created this sort of sanitized synthesis of Chinese medicine-ish that he actually thought would be appealing to Western medical doctors and scientists. He was in China. Whenever he'd ask one of his teachers a question, they'd kind of give the standard answer, and then they'd say, but if you really want to know, you need to look in the Neijing. And the Neijing is this 2,200-year-old text on which all of Chinese and East Asian medicine is based. What happens when you go back and study the original text is that this extremely rich cosmology emerges, this explanation of how the universe works, and then a small subsection of it is how health and disease works. And it's written in such a sophisticated level of detail that you have to wonder what they were smoking. More and more people waking up to this idea that the standard way of doing things is not working well. It's not working well for individuals, it's not working well for the collective, and there's a variety of reasons that the stories that keep that in place keep getting told, but it's not for your benefit. Our culture is very uninformed and very traumatizing, and then we have this increased collective awareness that of what trauma is, and that it can be little t and it can be big T, and it can live in our nervous system, but then everything becomes trauma.
Welcome back to Wholegrain Wisdom podcast, where we reconnect the science and the ancient wisdom to finally reveal they're the same fundamental truth, just sometimes, often, actually, explained in different languages. Today, I'm sitting with Mel Hopper Koppelman, a doctor, 15 years of clinical experience, going all the way from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, developmental neurology. You are the program director of Synthesis Health Lab. And today I brought you because I really understood we speak the same language when it comes to converging this ancient wisdom part of medicine or healing, of high performance interior kind of programming with the scientific language and the scientific rigor, let's say. So I'm very happy to have you here. How's it going today?
It's going really well. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. So we were chatting a little bit before this interview, and there's something that immediately came kind of like a light bulb when you were talking about your experience and your story, which is your personal journey going from the traditional ancient medicine kind of teachings into the, I wouldn't say new modern approach, because it's actually even older, but there has been a rediscovery around this topic through your mentors and your work. Can you tell us a little bit about your story? How did you get into what you're doing right now?
Sure. But when it comes to Chinese medicine, I came to Chinese medicine because I had a health issue. I originally thought I was going to go pre-med and go into medicine like my mom. My mom is a retired endocrinologist, hormone doctor, and she was also a National Institutes of Health researcher. So I always really loved science and loved medicine. And then I had a health issue. I was traveling in India and got really sick with this parasitic infection, and it was mistreated. So I was really sick for 2 years. Industrial medicine was not able to help me. And so I went into Chinese medicine. And so Chinese medicine education varies from school to school, but there's a kind of a standardized sort of version that's taught. And what a lot of people don't realize is that this is actually fairly modern from the 1960s and 70s. In China, there was something called the Cultural Revolution. And so Chairman Mao kind of created this sort of, invented this kind of sanitized synthesis of Chinese medicine-ish that he actually thought would be appealing to Western medical doctors and scientists. But it's tricky. There's a lot of promise there. And I think, people who study Chinese medicine, people who go for acupuncture in Chinese medicine, which is millions and millions of people all over the world outside of China, it's very popular. It's there's so much promise. And then there's a little bit I don't know what's going on, and if you ask a group of acupuncturists a question, you get a whole totally anything goes variety of answers. And when I was studying, I would ask a lot of questions, and a lot of them were scientific questions. And the types of answers I would get were something along the lines of well, you're asking that because you're coming from your modern perspective. But if you just meditate long enough and you become old and wise, and you won't even have that question anymore, which is not a great type of answer, right? And so, a lot of other things happened, but I found myself in 2020. So I trained in 2008 when I started my training. And so I found myself in 2020 really disillusioned with like a lot of things that I'd learned. I'd also learned functional medicine, and that also had a lot of promise, but people couldn't answer my questions. And so I declared intellectual bankruptcy and was like, I need to just start over. And I was fortunate enough at that time to connect with a number of really amazing teachers. And one of those teachers who taught me about what we're talking about, this kind of modern, ancient understanding of Chinese medicine, is a really brilliant man named Dr. Ed Neal. And he's a medical doctor. He was an emergency room physician who studied Chinese medicine, and he studied the kind of Western version that we all learn. And when he was in China, whenever he'd ask one of his teachers a question, they'd kind of give the standard answer, and then they'd say, but if you really want to know, you need to look in the Neijing. And the Neijing is this 2,200-year-old text on which all of Chinese and East Asian medicine is based. So Japanese medicine, Korean medicine, it's all traces its roots back to this text. And so after getting that answer enough times, he was like, well, I need to read this book, but it's written in classical Chinese. So even modern Chinese people most of them cannot read it. Just like, you can't necessarily read and understand Latin, even though you're from Italy, right? So he taught himself classical Chinese, and he spent years on his own translating it. And after about 4 years, he was like, I don't think this says what they taught us it says. And he was starting to pull out these themes from it. And he's like, but I'm like a white dude and living in Portland, Oregon. How is it that I'm kind of figuring this out? But it turns out he's not the only one to make these connections. But what happens when you go back and study the original text is that this extremely rich cosmology emerges, this explanation of how the universe works, and then a small subsection of it is how health and disease works. And it's written in such a sophisticated level of detail that you have to wonder what they were smoking. That there's like these myths that get repeated, like, oh, well, the people who wrote this book, dissections were against their religion, so they never saw the inside of the body. Like, oh, did they see inside of a body? I mean, they are detailing these pathways in many ways. This book is more sophisticated than what modern medicine understands in terms of the three-dimensional architecture of the body. And so, a bunch of really important and valuable themes emerge. But the most important thing that my teacher found was that when he applied the principles that he thought he was discovering, his results got much better, right? And so we could move from, what he calls like 40% medicine to like 80% medicine, where when you apply it with this interpretation, people get better, quicker, predictably. And so this is sort of the kind of the modern remix of the classical Chinese text.
Amazing. I was reading in a energy and frequency medicine book recently that ancient medicine, like Chinese medicine in the US or in Western society in general, is really, really new. Like it came around the 70s or something like that, because a president flew to China and he was sick and nobody could heal him. And then at some point he kind of got to a Chinese medicine doctor and he was able to cure him. And he was like, oh, wait a second, what is this? It's not Western medicine. How does it possibly work? And then from there, it completely like widespread, like I don't know if virus is a good metaphor in this case, but it definitely grew. You catch me very hard when you were talking about that he understood something about how the universe works. Is this something we can kind of get a little bit into? Because
sure.
One of the questions that I have is, I mean, the reason why I started all of this work, it was really going deep into the history. And so exactly the same work that your teacher did, like really going into even questioning some of the kind of assumptions that we give for granted because somebody else taught us, and we take for granted that is it, how it works. But in reality, you figure out, okay, there has been a loss in translation, some in many cases benevolent, unfortunately in other many cases not really benevolent, but let's say we lost a lot of information. It's been kind of like cut, and for simplicity, eventually it arrived to us in a very simplistic way, so we kind of lost the meaning afterward. So what is the map of how it works, if you can explain it from the traditional books that you studied, or even just your understanding as with your 15 years of experience? And why do we why is it so important to connect it to ourselves?
Yeah, no, these are really great questions. And it's funny, I think that the more people are educated in higher education, the more confused they get, because we kind of get into more abstractions. And especially when it comes to medicine, I noticed this quite a while ago, that there's what I would call like a war on common sense, where you're not allowed to just just look at someone in front of you and kind of get a sense of how someone's doing. Everything has to be, a scan and a long Greek word and things like that. But a lot of what ancients knew was really some of it could fall into the category of common sense and things that people knew, and people around the world still know, if they're not talked out of it. So what my teacher discovered in his very careful reading of this, and it's very he's very open to debate and that sort of thing, but he references his perspective very nicely, which I appreciate, is that when you look at the Neijing, this text, it's very long. It's 2 books of 81 chapters. So it's like 162 chapters. And basically it keeps referring to things on 3 levels. And so it refers to things on like the universal or cosmological level. So this is how things work in the universe. Then on the terrestrial earthly level, this is how things work here on Earth. And then inside the human body, this is how things work in people. And so Earth is in the universe, but it has special rules because we're on a Goldilocks planet that's orbiting the sun, and and it's on a bit of a tilt on an axis, and it's going around. And so that's like one broad theme of the text, is that they're describing these kind of sets of rules. And so one of the big ones, I've actually just started using AI to create an app that would let me analyze the Neijing, because I was getting frustrated because it's such a long book. Like after, 6 years of studying with Ed, I've still not read it from cover to cover because it's just so massive. And I'm like, what is in here? How long is it? There aren't, really good translations. So why was I talking about that? Because part of it was that I asked it to show me in order the frequency of each character. So I just wanted to pull out themes that way. So the most commonly used character is Chi, which is maybe not too big of a surprise. And so basically one of the things that it's saying, and I've heard some of your guests say the same thing, so that's also nice when that happens, is that basically the universe started as a void, and then there was an impulse to move. And basically that movement, for whatever reason, is an oscillating motion. And so that oscillating motion we could describe as being like a breath, like an inhale and an exhale. So when people say, everything's made of waves, that's another way of saying that we have all these oscillations nested inside one big oscillation. So the inhale of that breath, which is where you're starting at a root and then you're expanding from that root, is called yang. And when you have the reverting motion, collapsing inwards, becoming more dense, going back to the root, that is called yin. And I want to pause that, you can go on the internet and you can find a bajillion different definitions of yin and yang. And they'll say things like, hot and cold, or masculine and feminine. And these, and I'll say 2 things about that. One is that the Neijing contains big universal definitions and then smaller contextual definitions. So the definition of yin and yang that I just gave is the universal definition of what it always means. And then you can talk about specific examples of how that shows up in little different contexts. But it also, it's nice because it gives you a much firmer understanding that it's a motion, it's not a thing, and there's a lot that gets baked into that. So for example, depending on how far you want to go with it, right, that when you have this expanding motion is actually when dimensions get created and things get more complex. And then when you have this, exhale and this reverting motion, things break down and so on. So that's one of the big ideas from this text, and we can apply it in infinite ways, but that's one of the big ideas.
It's amazing that you mentioned this. I to be honest, before meeting you, I've never heard anything about this book. But as I keep doing this deep research, and you were talking about the app, I have a Claude co-work session, which I think he analyzed at least 150 books or even more. And I'm trying to build a knowledge graph just to keep a visual understanding of what's happening. But at the end of the day, the essence keeps going back to exactly what you mentioned. And it's crazy because all of this journey for me started when I got married in Colombia in the middle of a jungle, just me, my wife, and a shaman. And he was talking about all of these concepts of how the universe works. And he was talking in Spanish to us. And somehow I reconnected it back to exactly the same things that my Buddhist teacher in Italy, speaking in English, was translating from the Tibetan books. And I was like, wait a second, they're saying the same thing. And then the more that I go deeper and the more that every single other ancient book exactly describes the same thing. Now, how does it get into ourselves? Because I have my own definition. I actually have a course that is called the Science of Healing and Awakening. And the very first 2 lectures are only about how the energy of the universe works and how it doesn't get into biology. But I'm curious to know, what's your understanding? What's your definition? How do you bring it to people so that they really understand, A, we are not separate, and B, why making this common sense kind of correlation, it's so effective for healing and for just, unleashing the best version of ourselves?
I mean, that's a nice question. What I would say really is that I love having conversations like this, but often this is not the level at which it's most helpful for people to understand or to start. Like, when working with people, you need to communicate in their own metaphors, in their own language, tie it to what's important for them. So I really enjoy discussing how the universe works and how,
but then how to
the
get
Colombian
practical.
shamans figured out the same things, but when people are on their like journeys of healing and self-actualization, often, there's like maybe crisis going on, or, it could be different for different people, but, if it's, whether it's bills to pay or health challenges or just feeling stuck, this sort of conversation is one path, but it's not, but there's other paths that are often that we have to get started with first.
How would you start then?
Mm-hmm.
How would you start, like for like to bring it more into like the grounding level? Where do we start from?
Yeah, so, there's this idea, and I think it's actually fairly universal in the hero's journey, is that, I listen to how the person perceives their problem. And so they'll, because I work with people who have chronic health challenges, not all, so, more and more I'm working with people who are healthy and want to stay healthy. Like, they'll see how their parents are aging and they don't want to do that, so I work with people like that too. But a lot of the people I work with have really, really complex health challenges, and they've had it for a long time. So I'm listening to, like, how do they see their challenges? It's usually about symptoms and those types of problems, and then also what they're missing out on, or the problems in their life that's causing. And whether it's a health challenge or a different challenge, the punchline always tends to be that when you zoom out and can see it from a higher perspective, you realize that the way that you're looking at it is the problem. And then once you zoom out, then you can kind of navigate more clearly. So there's that kind of universality to it, but also it needs to be kind of that sort of choose your own adventure thing that we have going on in our life. Like, that we have to tie it to what they need. So, but some people might come in and they're fetishizing Chinese medicine and spirituality, and I need to tie them back to their body and say, look, these are the reps that we need to do. And for other people, maybe they over-identify with their body, or they're just not, maybe a lot of people have been told to expect quick fixes or biohacks or quick change, and not understanding that they are a complex system and what that means. And so the kind of rules that we need to understand to interface with that system intelligently.
Yeah. We were discussing before getting on the records that there's definitely no silver bullet. And I think anybody that is really serious about doing the work understood this. And I think another thing that I understood fairly recently is that keep listening to what is the standard in whatever person that is speaking is not necessarily the standard for you. What could you say about this? Because, I can make a very simple example that I don't know if it's relevant to the specific person listening, or it's mostly like into the biohacking kind of world. But I don't know, like all of this talk about creatine, for example, like I even tried, I wanted to believe that you could get so much grams of fake stuff in your body, and my body kept rejecting it. And then at some point I really realized, okay, wait a second, probably the standard number that they're giving, it's fake, or it's fake for me. So how do you go with this kind of conversations?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's let me just clear my throat. Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, there's two things baked into that. One, and I really like that question you're asking, is really about like who, when a claim is made, who are they talking about? That, like, one of the biggest things I see over and over again, and it really pains me, is that because I kind of have my one foot in performance world and other foot in like, helping people heal from illness. And what I see a lot is that you'll see these innovations coming out of like athletics and how to, get athletes to keep pushing boundaries and doing like more and more extreme things. And so then they'll discover something like, well, whatever it is, it changes every few months, right? So I don't know, molecular hydrogen or HBOT or, red light therapy, or whatever it is that's applied to athletes. And then it'll somehow filter onto a podcast for people who are really ill and oh, this is really good for your mitochondria. And as someone who was a pretty high level athlete for my age when I was younger, and also was really sick for many years, I can tell you that high level athletes and sick people are two different species. Like their metabolisms work completely differently as two big groups. And so whenever I see something that's used to speed up recovery from performance, I'm like, you should be very cautious about taking this, because your body's going to do something completely different with it than that, that athlete over there. So that's one idea. And then the other idea is really kind of a broader question about categorizing inputs, right? So like creatine is an example of an input. There's loads of them. So any type of supplement is an input. Herbs and herbal formulas, food or a specific diet, I suppose. But even like grounding mats, or again, red light therapy, or pulse electromagnetic field, or psilocybin, or meditation and breath work. These are all inputs, right? And so I think what I want to help people realize that there's like this kind of one conversation, which is like more and more people waking up to this idea that the standard way of doing things is not working well. It's not working well for individuals, it's not working well for the collective, and there's a variety of reasons that the stories that keep that in place keep getting told, but it's like not for your benefit, and so then they look over here and they're like, oh, there's all this stuff over here, like the ancient wisdom and the biohacks, and it's very exciting. Meditation, there's a lot of gold here. It needs to be organized, so that people have a way of navigating. And I suppose that's maybe part of the benefit of my journey. I was reflecting that it's not too uncommon to hear about someone who maybe was a medical doctor and got sick and then found alternative medicine. But when I got sick again 10 years ago, I already had 2 master's degrees in health sciences and alternative medicine. And what I was doing still wasn't working. So I had to kind of go even further and be like, right, how do we organize this? What are the actual first principles here? Because the mitochondrial boost stuff is not fixing the problem, right? Or the meditation's not fixing the problem either. So it's really understanding the first principles of how people work, so that you can answer the question like, am I the right person for this input? But also like, where do I start? And how do I understand these things in a way that would help me select it? So if you think about any other complex project, you might think about running a business, but like something a little less abstract, like building a house, there's tools, but like you wouldn't be like, hey, what hammer should I use? That's not the right question. Am I the right type? Am I building the right type of house for this hammer? It's like that's not where we start. We for renovating a house, we need to assess where the problems are. We need to go in a sensible order. So like if the windows are broken and the roof is leaking, then we're not going to start fixing the electrics. And yes, it's good to have good tools, but it's even more important to have good application and be organized and go in order. And so we're kind of, no matter how much we try to fight it, we really are seduced by the new and shiny, like that edge and that silver bullet, like who doesn't want the thing that's going to give them more energy and more focus and better memory, like, and better, sex drive and all that. Like, of course, everyone wants it. But once you take enough laps in that, and sometimes you'll get benefits. What I see commonly, people might get an initial benefit and then it stops working, but they keep taking it almost like out of superstition, or they don't know if it's helping or not. They don't notice any different, but they're still believing the story. Well, this is good for my mitochondria, so I should take it. And so it's really, once you can organize these things and do a clearer job of assessing how you're responding to things, that you can then start navigating a way forward.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're kind of describing my own journey per se, because of course, I guess because of the way that we are taught at school or society things, we all get there at some point and we get stuck there. And it's all about, finding the little things. I still remember like kind of reading the book of the flow cycle, and then understanding, that's why I'm kind of collapsing every 3 months. And then, if I take this and this and this, then I'm going to prolong my flow. And then after a while, then I really realized, wait a second. This has nothing to do with myself. And then I started, in this case, I went even deeper into my own energy profile and how do I actually convert the energy from the universe and from life into the actual biological, chemical reactions. And then it's like, now this actually is even more precise on myself. And for anyone that is ever heard about astrology and human design and other tools, but if never done it because, it's too woo-woo, try for free to just write a basic prompt on Claude with your charts, and you will figure out by yourself if it's really random and woo-woo, but that's really powerful. Anyhow, I'm curious now, let's get a little bit into kind of like the typical situation of the people that are within the community of Wholegrain Wisdom. So we do a lot of work to connect the dots, as I mentioned, but especially these dots are serving the people that have done all of the work and still understood there's something more, especially when it comes to the shifting between thinking that you are your body and you are your chemistry into, there's something a little bit bigger here. There is energy. How does the energy works, et cetera, et cetera. So how would you kind of guide somebody? Because you said, we need a map. We need to give the basics first and then slowly build on top of it. How would you navigate somebody that is into that kind of transcendent point between the pure physical into something that it goes even beyond and it connects to the power of the mind and all of that?
I'm now hearing another mentor of mine, his voice in my head, where almost excuse me, almost like all advice is good sometimes, like that I could say something that's true sometimes, but maybe not for you listening, right? So I think again, I don't know, I don't know how I would answer that in the abstract. I think another thing that we learned from the Neijing about how people work is that we're like really well differentiated trees that walk and tell stories. So sometimes getting a little bit simpler. Again, a lot of the people that I see are quite like you described, that they've done a ton of work, not everyone, but like a lot of them, they've done all of the things, and they're, still have a problem. They're trying to figure it out. And usually it's about having a blind spot somewhere. And I know that's a little bit vague, but like, if you go back to first principles of like, different buckets that we want to look at, usually people have just put too much focus on one bucket. An example of this with health, especially in countries like the United States, and certainly some others, is if over focusing on nutrition. So there's like a cultural under focus on nutrition. Like, I don't know why I feel like garbage. I just have like high fructose corn syrup and like ultra processed food, but like I'm healthy or whatever, low cal, whatever that is. And then the pendulum swings to like, oh my gosh, that's like crazy, you know, and then it needs to be whatever it needs to be, organic and local and gluten-free and all of these things. But many people will maybe shift their diet and have like initial benefits and wins, but then they keep going down that path and going, well, what if I cut out lectins? You know, what if I cut out casein? What if I cut out legumes? And they're basically having diminishing returns for that focus because they're missing out on other things. And I would say the same thing when you talk about the spiritual transition. Sometimes it's that it's not embodied enough. You know, what I see in this, I suppose, you know, kind of the social media version of the spiritual communities that we see online, a lot of them, you know, are very, you know, spiritual bypassy, you know, like that they only like the good emotions, they don't like the bad emotions, that sort of thing. But also that if we over focus on a spiritual path, we can become quite dissociated. And so that's like one potential pitfall. And so if someone's been doing a lot of focus on trauma work and this and that and the other, or you know, again, another pendulum swing I see is like our culture is very trauma uninformed and very traumatizing, which is not good. And then we have this, you know, increased collective awareness that, you know, of what trauma is, and that it can be little t and it can be big T, and it can live in our nervous system. But then everything becomes trauma. And so actually that's one of the big things that, you know, people coming in that I see, they're doing a lot of trauma work, but they don't have the basics met for, like, you know, the tree that I'm talking about, like, you know, sunlight and water and nutrients and fresh air. And you can't survive on trauma work alone, and on, you know, psychedelic journeys and rituals alone. You know, you still have a human body. And so, and really, I would say it's like, the world, the earth, the planet needs us here, you know, that maybe people get interested in spirituality and now they're like only astral projecting and they're only in the stars, and they're like, you know, using astrology, but not as like a way to guide their life, but they're kind of stuck in the stars. And it's like, earth needs us here. We're like really needed here. So maybe for a certain percentage of the people who are listening to this, maybe that invitation is like, you know, you're working so much in your past and your psyche and you're trying to come all this down, but really coming back into your body and realizing that that's part of the spiritual realm too. It all is. It all is.
Yeah, I really love this framing, and I don't know. Maybe the immediate question that comes out from here is that how can people do this by themselves? I mean, of course, one way is to work with you, is to work with other communities, work with Wholegrain Wisdom. And this is all the bits and pieces that we are all doing to support the broader community. But at the same time, it feels like, one thing that I don't want necessarily to let the people listening to us think is that you need to spend your life studying to become like the master of everything in order to live it. I mean, I have my own experience, and I'm a geek when it comes to these topics because that's my life passion. But I do completely understand that others' people life passion is different. So why would I have to go so deep into all of these topics? I mean, if there's probably something that ancient wisdom can teach us is the general levels, but then the general is too general. Like, I mean, where do you start then?
Well, so what that question brings up for me is this, that, you know, a lot of what we're talking about in terms of doing inner work and trauma work and raising our awareness is that we humans live in our stories, and we live in collective stories, and we live in individual stories. And the collective stories, the mainstream stories, and this is really, in many ways, very shared across industrialized countries, are not good stories. They are stories that create illness. They are stories that keep people trapped, that keep people from learning the things that you're talking about, and they keep people from understanding things that are true. Even this idea, which I like, where talking about spirituality might be unacceptable to certain people, but they can absorb it when it's put in scientific language. That's a result of the mainstream stories that are told about spirituality and about science, and that they are a product of. And so that's why we need to kind of wrap that pill in that meat, is because they're inside of it. And so people, listen, people are different, and this is a global platform, so people are in different cultures and they're all over the world. But if you are in and ultimately like an unhealthy culture, and that can be physical health, that can be mental health, that can be the stories that are impoverishing stories about how much do you need to work, what do you need to look like, what is your value tied to, do you need to do everything yourself, all sorts of stories. Then overcoming that, if that's the water you're swimming in, then I'm sorry to say it usually takes a bit of work to undo that, because you're swimming against the current. And those those stories are pervasive. We're talking about waves again. You are swimming in those waves, and it really is not easy to stay sane and clear and attached to reality when all the waters around you are trying to get you to do otherwise. So, it would be nice if it was really simple, and someone's like, I don't want to like spend all my time learning about spirituality. Like, I'm just like an artist, or when I say just, I mean, that's amazing if you're an artist, but I'm an artist, or I have other interests. I don't want to do this. Well, that's fine. But what I would say is that really a big key is finding a community of shared values. And that might not be the one that you've defaulted into. It probably isn't. And if it is, then you're very lucky, and that's wonderful. So I guess there's like two threads there. One is surround yourself with people who are holding the level of consciousness that you want to hold and share, which may take some work depending on your starting point. But if you are not swimming in that water yet, and you're surrounded by people who think that eating poison is normal, and passively going to the doctor and just taking whatever pill they've been told to prescribe is healthcare and the education and all that stuff, if that's the waters you're swimming in and you want something else, then it's going to take a bit of work, probably.
Wonderful. I loved. Thanks so much for sharing this perspective. It really also touched me deeply. Let me wrap it up. Let me ask you one last question before we go. How do you see the future then?
Yeah, it's funny. So this is just something like my personal experience. What I'm experiencing now is that I have started to be able to see different futures, and then I guess I understand them probabilistically, and maybe you call them timelines. So I see these timelines, and I see that right now they're all possible, and some of them are really dystopian, and they're not super unlikely. And then I also see other ones that are really positive, because we are using such a small amount of our potential as individual and collective humans that we wouldn't have to do much to massively improve it. And I see that possibility too. And so I see my work and the work of others who choose to do this work is just trying to shift the timeline in a more positive direction to increase the probability of the beautiful one emerging and decrease the possibility of the dystopian one emerging. So that, which is to say that how I see the future is both really, grim, but also possibly, and possibly really amazing.
Amazing. Wonderful. Where can people find you? How do you work with people? Let give us kind of like a little bit of the contact details for you, so that the people that have been inspired by this conversation can contact.
Well, I don't know if it's inspiring, but I think what people can count on me for is like loving honesty that's hopefully useful and pragmatic. Then it's no good to say like just breathe and find your inner light and everything will be great. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But let's if it's not, then you need some other things to do, right? I feel like that's more loving in some ways. So if after listening to all of this you would like to work with me, I can be found at synthesishealth.co, and you can find out about the group that I run, which is called Synthesis Health Lab, and it's an amazing group. The people in it that I've been running this for a number of years now, and it's a phenomenal group. It's people who are really respectful, they're really positive, they hold space, and as I say, most of the people in there have chronic illnesses that are getting better. Some people come in because they want to be proactive, and I'm really teaching health creation as a lifelong skill. You don't have to be sick to benefit from this information. It's kind of information that everyone really needs. And so I allow people to apply and be a free guest in that group. You're in the group with real members, and you see how I answer questions. You can ask me any questions that you might have. You get access to a load of material to learn more new ways of thinking, and a lot of people get benefit just from that. And then if you decide that you see a future there for yourself and you want to undergo more of a long-term transformation, then you can apply to be an annual member and do the Synthesis Health program there.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Mel. It's been really a wonderful conversation, even more than what I could ever expected. So thanks so much. And thanks to anyone that joined us here. Once again, this is the Wholegrain Wisdom podcast, converging science and ancient wisdom for true healing.
Thank you.